The gold dome of Connecticut's dignified state capitol is an emblem of the Gilded Age, a symbol of the traditional power and influence of a wealthy elite. But poorer neighborhoods in Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport lacked a clear voice in state politics. All that changed a decade ago in 2008, when Connecticut implemented public financing for state elections, one of 4 states using this model reform. Suddenly, new people could run for office, like Navy veteran Gary Winfield, now a state senator from New Haven.
I could not have run under the old system of financing campaigns. I just couldn't have raised enough money to compete with an incumbent.
Or Senator Marilyn Moore, who runs a nonprofit in Bridgeport helping African-American breast cancer patients.
I'm a person from a low-income community who had children very young, who did depend on food stamps for a while. I would not have even thought about running for state senate without this funding.
They personify the changing face of the legislature: more women, blacks, and Hispanics. Changes triggered by the scandal-driven resignation in 2004 of third-term Republican Governor John Rowland.
I acknowledge that my poor judgment has brought us here.
Rowland was sentenced to 1 year in prison for taking $100,000 in kickbacks from state contractors.
The public was fed up with corruption. There was a sense that the state, which had prided itself on pretty clean politics, had suddenly become tainted.
Today, we begin to restore faith, integrity, and honor to our government.
As Rowland's successor, Republican Jody Rell, took her oath as governor, she called for reform.
Governor Rell wanted to ban contributions from state contractors and state lobbyists. The Democrats who controlled the General Assembly then were concerned that that would mean the loss of too much campaign revenue.
But public pressure turned the tide. The Connecticut Citizen Action Group, an alliance of 50 civic groups, pressed for sweeping reforms, tight limits on campaign donations, plus public funding of campaigns.
In order to get the legislature and the governor to embrace truly comprehensive reform, there had to be a lot of grassroots pressure on the outside. Thousands of phone calls. There were car washes for clean elections. We did all kinds of grassroots activities.
Republican Senator Len Fasano, originally a skeptic,
Governor Rell sought out senators, including myself,
became a yes vote. Reporters say both parties got dragged into reform.
Typically, the party in power and the leaders in the party in power resist either gerrymander reform or campaign finance reform because the system is working for them. How did Connecticut break that? What moved the legislature? What moved the people who liked the system they had?
It was a moment in time where the public shaming worked, the outside pressure worked, and finally the inside game decided this was the way to go.
The final vote to overhaul campaign finance came at 2:44 this morning.
Eventually, it passed in special session. Much to everyone's surprise, we ended up with a system of public financing for legislative races and statewide races.
The reform was bold. A tight lid of $100 on all private campaign donations, including lobbyists, plus public grants from $25,000 for House races, $110,000 for Senate, up to $3 million for the governor's race, later doubled to $6 million. To qualify, candidates must first prove popular support by raising a quota of small local contributions.
$5 to $100 from individuals that live in their districts, and based on a qualifying amount, we give them public monies to run their campaigns.
After that, no more fundraising, but using public funds is voluntary, so no one knew if candidates would do it. But right away in 2008, it took off. Today, it's solid. In 2014 and 2018, 80% of legislators from both parties used public funding. In 2014, all candidates for statewide offices used it. In 2018, 3/4 did. Total cost, $12 million for legislative elections, $30 million when statewide offices are also up for election. One big surprise, taxpayers don't foot the bill.
No, there's no tax. The money that funds the Citizens Election Program comes from abandoned state properties. There's a multitude of monies that come into the state of Connecticut and then are dispersed.
What's more, says Senate Republican leader Len Fasano, campaigns are better.
I think campaigns are more issue-oriented, more focused on debates. You can have more conversations with your constituency as opposed to raising money.
Public funding forces more interaction at the grassroots.
You're balancing the budget off the lives of the poor. People are on the bottom. We don't see any of that money in our communities.
I get how people feel about people in politics, right? I get that. I've been there. It's the reason I'm here, actually.
Needing small donors to qualify, Winfield connects with everyday people.
The older woman who's living by herself, trying to struggle to get by day, who has no way of interacting with me. You have a system of public financing that changes the way that I campaign. And when I knock on her door, she tells me a story I never would have heard. And when I sit in Hartford and I remember that story, some of the policy that I create comes from that story.
So more voice for little people, less clout for big money lobbyists.
Relationships still matter, but they don't matter because of the checkbook that's in the lobbyist's breast pocket.
We saw real changes in the power of lobbyists. We saw reforms in schools to get junk food out of schools. This was a state that was the first state to pass paid sick leave, and the business industry did not have the same kind of power.
This bill addresses gun violence prevention.
It was also easier, some say, to pass tough gun control legislation after the Sandy Hook school massacre in 2012.
Groups like the NRA were not able to influence individual politicians here because they don't fund them.
Republicans complained that after the Supreme Court Citizens United decision, Democrats loosened limits on campaign spending by parties and PACs. But in 2014, when Democratic leaders suggested abolishing the entire program to save money, lawmakers in both parties rebelled.
There was an uproar. You had members who were drawing lines in the sand. We will not eviscerate the system of public financing. It's too important.
The leaders backed down, and now public funding seems embedded.
We have had a record of success through 5 election cycles at this point.
If we funded the pure method like we originally had it, I think we were a model for the country.
I think the culture has shifted. I think in Connecticut the culture is that the public financing of campaigns is what Connecticut does.